Low lean mass increases your risk of dying from cancer by 70%. It increases your risk of dying from colon cancer by over 300%. Amongst people who enter the intensive care unit, those who have more muscle mass have a better chance of surviving than people with less muscle mass. People with low muscle mass have a 1,200% increased risk of losing their physical independence versus those with more muscle mass. If you want to live a long time and have a high quality of life, it is an imperative. What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Dr. Layne Norton Podcast. I'm your host, Layne Norton, and in this episode, we're going to talk about why your life depends on building muscle. Now, that may sound a little bit weird. Your life depends on building muscle. And I think for many of us, when we get into lifting weights or fitness or whatever, there's kind of like these two spheres. There's the aesthetic vanity side of things, and then there's the people who also care about their overall health. And the reality is that building muscle is one of the essential components to living a healthy, low disease life. I don't want to say disease-free because you're never at 0% risk of getting a particular disease. The reality is that one of the biggest components, one of the biggest levers you can pull for living a healthy life is to build muscle. Muscle has been called the organ of longevity, the organ of health, and I have to agree. I started writing a book on muscle building a while back. Don't ask me when it's going to come out. It's going to be a while. Grab a Snickers. It's going to be a little bit. But the more I looked into the research literature, I was just astounded, quite frankly. I didn't even realize how critical muscle mass was for living a healthy lifestyle, for living longer, for surviving diseases, trauma better. The data is honestly kind of unbelievable. And I think a lot of people, myself included, when we go down the road of lifting weights or getting into resistance training or trying to build muscle, a lot of us, it was exclusively for aesthetic purposes. Like, I'm going to be completely honest. When I started lifting weights when I was 15 years old, or I think I was 14, I did so because I wanted to get jacked. Like, I wanted to be muscular for reasons of I wanted to stop getting picked on by bullies and I wanted to get attention from girls. So I started lifting weights for very, very shallow reasons. I started trying to build muscle for very, very shallow reasons. But now at age 43, after 25 plus years of lifting, I have reaped the benefits of lifting weights. And I see this every day when I see people who are my age who look 10, 15, 20 years older visually, but then also internally are not very healthy either. And my experience is the experience of many people in terms of how they viewed resistance training, building muscle as a kind of purely vanity thing. And when I got into lifting weights in the late 90s, early 2000s, I mean, the perception of building muscle was like you were a meathead. You were brainless. You were a jock. You know, this wasn't something that people with brains did. This was something that dumb people did who didn't really have much else to offer. And you see this in like movies and popular TV. Typically, your really muscular guy in a movie or a TV show is not really the most intelligent. In fact, usually the least intelligent. Things have started to change more recently. I mean, my favorite book series of all time is the Jack Reacher book series, and the show is awesome. And obviously, like Jack Reacher in the books and in the show is very muscular, but also extremely intelligent. And as we go through some of this literature, what you're going to find is the reality is closer to Jack Reacher than it is the big dumb oaf who just lifts weights and doesn't have a brain. I don't want to give away too much because there is some fun data to comb through. But this idea that lifting weights is for the brainless is just not supported by data. Now, I can tell you when I went to graduate school circa, 2004 to 2010, there was already a shift starting to happen with lifting weights. But I will tell you, being in a PhD program and being a bodybuilder, a competitive bodybuilder, I definitely still got looks from people. It was definitely not a normal thing. I actually did get a nice compliment by the head of our division when I was graduating. He said, "You got a PhD and you've got arms like that? That's impressive." I think what he means is, it's difficult to get a PhD. It's difficult to build a good physique. To do both, obviously requires a lot of time. I do think this idea still persists that it's kind of one of the two. Either you're going to be a book nerd or a nerdy scientist who's like pencil thin or overweight or whatever, or you're going to be not very academically inclined and you're going to be jacked. And these are kind of your options. And the reality is these are not the options. And then I think it's also important to point out the perception of women, which thankfully is starting to change. I mean, if you go into a gym now, any big box chain gym, I would say there's about as many women in there lifting weights as there are men now. When I first got into training back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I mean, the number of women who were in the gym was definitely lower than men. Most of them, I would say, would be doing cardio or aerobic stuff. And if by chance they were lifting weights, usually they were not doing so with intensity. Now, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush because obviously there were women who trained hard back then too. But the current crop of women in the gym are completely different than it was 20 years ago. Where 20 years ago, again, women were encouraged, well, you don't want to look too muscular. You don't want to get too bulky. Lift light weights. You just want to be toned. And, the reality is, I tell people all the time, I have spent my entire adult life trying to get as jacked as possible without drugs, without steroids. And in a t-shirt, I look like an athletic guy. Like, it is unless you have amazing genetics, it is very, very hard to build muscle. And so the likelihood that somebody is just going to randomly become too muscular is like saying, well, I don't want to drive because I might end up driving NASCAR. It's like, no, you're probably not going to happen by accident. So I'm glad to see that some of these ideas about lifting weights are changing with the new generations. But some of these perceptions still persist to this day. And the turn of muscle being viewed as a vanity thing to muscle being viewed as something that is beneficial for health has been very, very slow. And is still, I don't think people are aware of just how robust the data is. Because if they were, muscle building would be at the forefront of almost anyone's health program. People worry about the obesity epidemic, and absolutely having excess body fat is an independent risk factor for a lot of diseases. But did you know, independent of having body fat, having too little muscle is probably as big of a risk factor, if not bigger risk factor for many diseases? Most people don't know that because we are so focused on Americans are overweight, obese, we got to lose weight, we got to lose weight, we got to lose weight. But we're not putting the same effort into promoting building muscle. In this episode, I'm going to go through the data and really piece apart why you should care about building muscle, even if you don't want to look like me. Not that I'm like the Adonis epitome or anything like that. But even if you look at somebody like me and go, oh man, he's way too muscular. That's fine. You don't have to look like me. You don't have to get super muscular, but you should absolutely try to get adequately muscled, because being under muscled is one of the most devastating things you can do to your body in terms of raising your risk for disease, disability, and early death. So you should absolutely care about building muscle. Now, talk about the change in perception of how muscle building was viewed. And for a long time, for even once I got into graduate school, 20 some years ago, God, it has been 20 plus years ago, building muscle or lifting weights was generally viewed as a positive thing, mostly because, you can build some muscle, seems to be good for insulin sensitivity and bone density. And if we build some muscle, if we lift weights, it gets people's bones denser, and that's going to be good for our elderly population. And there already was quite a bit of research literature on something called sarcopenia. And sarcopenia is the progressive loss of muscle mass over time that occurs once you hit about age 40. There's kind of a steady decline in muscle mass. It's anywhere from 0.5% to 1% per year after age 40. Now, again, I am painting with a broad brush. Don't want to get too far ahead, but it is not a foregone conclusion that you are going to lose muscle after age 40, especially if you lift weights, if you use it. Okay, so I don't want people out there go, well, I'm 40, here comes the end. I just literally this last week set an all-time PR for me and deadlifted 700 pounds for 2 reps in the gym as a 43-year-old. I'd never done that before. And I would say my muscle mass is very, very similar to what it was 10 years ago. I would say it's probably no different or maybe even slightly more. So just because you hit age 40 doesn't mean you're going to have this progressive loss of muscle mass. But if you aren't resistance training, then yes, around age 40 is when this starts to happen. And there seems to be a few mechanisms for it. A lot of it is inactivity. And if you aren't active, you will lose your muscle. Even doing like endurance exercise, walking will maintain your muscle better than just being sedentary. Anything is better than being sedentary. There also appears to be changes in cellular metabolism that may contribute to sarcopenia. If we look at the rates of muscle protein synthesis amongst elderly versus young, the basal rates of muscle protein synthesis, that is, if you measure muscle protein synthesis when people are fasted, so if you're measuring muscle protein synthesis between elderly and young fasted, you won't see differences. They're the same. However, their meal responses of muscle protein synthesis are different. And so elderly do not have nearly as much of a robust response to feeding as the young do in terms of muscle protein synthesis. And a classic paper, I believe by Volpe back in 2005, and I'm going to butcher the title, but it was something like anabolic signaling deficits underlie muscle wasting. And basically what they showed was the components of the mTOR pathway, and the mTOR pathway is how protein stimulates muscle protein synthesis. I don't want to go too deep on this pathway right now, but essentially this pathway, which involves mTOR, a binding protein complex called EIF4F, and mTOR essentially stimulates the assembly of EIF4F, as well as a protein called ribosomal S6 protein. Elderly people have less of those components, and they don't respond as robustly to feeding as young. But what is cool about the follow-up studies was they showed that if you get protein high enough at a meal in the elderly, you can get the same response as the young. You just need more protein. So I think it was something like, if you look at young people, if you give a meal of like 10 to 15 grams of protein from a high quality source, you'll get a response to muscle protein synthesis. But in elderly, you're going to need 25, 30 plus grams of protein at a similar meal to get the same response. And so as we age, if we want to maintain or build muscle, our protein requirements likely go up. So this appears to be one of the ways in which sarcopenia occurs over time. So this is 20 years ago. We acknowledge that sarcopenia probably isn't good for you, but we're thinking about it more so from a functionality perspective, quality of life perspective, we're thinking, oh, well, if elderly have more muscle, they'll be able to stay ambulatory longer. They won't need wheelchairs, walkers, be bedridden. They're less likely to fall because they have better balance. They have more muscle to kind of stop themselves from falling. So they have a lower risk of fractures. And so we were kind of looking at it as, okay, these are the real health benefits of muscle. And then we also acknowledge, well, having more muscle definitely improves insulin sensitivity. Again, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but when you're looking at insulin sensitivity, obesity, type 2 diabetes, what you want to think about is type 2 diabetes is characterized basically by you have elevated blood glucose, even though you produce insulin. And your peripheral tissues, your muscle and your fat tissue, essentially become insensitive to the insulin you produce over time. And in my opinion, a lot of what causes insulin resistance is you have put so much into the system, so much energy in the form of dietary carbohydrates, fats. You put so much calories into the system. Your body has to find a place to dispose of those fats, those carbohydrates. And its two largest depots to do so are muscle and adipose tissue, fat tissue. But if you are not building muscle, your body is not going to just randomly put things in muscle tissue. Now, there is evidence that people with type 2 diabetes actually have greater infiltration of fat in muscle tissue. But you've only got a limited glycogen storage. You can only put so much intramuscular fat in. And in adipose is thought of as kind of this unlimited storage area. But the reality is that adipose is somewhat limited. So fat cells are these cells that have kind of this minimal amount of protein and carbohydrate in terms just to make the structure of the cell. And then the center or the middle of these cells is just a ton of triacylglyceride, TAGs. So you're stuffing a bunch of fat in there that you can then use later for energy. And so it's this huge reservoir of triacylglycerides. But you can only expand the cell so far in diameter until the cell basically becomes untenable, where you just can't put any more in without the cell maintaining its structural integrity. And also, adipose tissue isn't just like free floating around your body. It's scaffolded onto an extracellular matrix. And too much shrinking of those fat cells or too much expansion of those fat cells causes stress to the extracellular matrix, which may initiate some signaling that causes changes. Now, where am I going with all this? Well, if we're not building muscle, your skeletal muscle is kind of set. Your most responsive and adaptable depot to excess energy is adipose tissue. And so if you are consuming excess calories, carbohydrates, fats, those are going to be shuttled to adipose tissue. But as those cells expand, over time, it becomes harder and harder to get more into those cells, especially as they begin to approach their maximum size. And what happens is you have fatty acids and glucose kind of stuck in the bloodstream because you just can't shove any more into these cells. Now, there is evidence that your body can create new adipocytes. This isn't a static number. Your body can create new adipocytes. But that tends to be kind of a longer process, but it appears that it can happen in adults. Now, here's why I think the way I view this model of insulin sensitivity and type 2 diabetes is accurate is people who have less fat cells, so a lower number of fat cells, they actually become type 2 diabetic faster than people who have more fat cells. So people with more fat cells can become fatter essentially before they start to become insulin resistant, because the individual fat cells it will take them longer, because there's so many, for them to actually expand to the point where the excess blood glucose and fatty acids are backed up into the bloodstream, to the point where they're having difficulty getting in to the fat cells. And for a long time, one of our main diabetes treatments was a drug that actually was a PPAR gamma agonist. So this drug actually helped with type 2 diabetes by stimulating the production of new fat cells, new really small fat cells that then, think of it like a sponge. These fat cells are small fat cells are kind of like wrung out. And so they can sop up excess energy much easier. Whereas fat cells that have expanded really far, think of a sponge that's just completely watered down. If you spill some water on your table and your sponge is already saturated, you go to pick it up, nothing happens. So by giving these drugs, they created more fat cells, and it lowered people's blood glucose and their blood lipids. So once you have exceeded your skeletal muscle's capacity to store glucose and fats, once you've exceeded your capacity of your adipose tissue to store glucose and fats, now that excess energy in the form of glucose and fats starts rising in the bloodstream because you have no place to put it. But here's the great thing about muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is like a metabolic sink. If you build more muscle tissue, you have a greater amount of glucose and fats you can dispose of, because one, as you create more muscle, you can store more glycogen, and two, more muscle is energetically expensive and it burns through more energy. And so if you are kind of churning through more energy, now, if you think about, any of you who've had chemistry, if you've heard of the term Le Chatelier's principle, this is kind of a biochemical Le Chatelier's principle. As you are burning through more energy inside the cell, that cell now needs to get more energy so it can start pulling it out of the bloodstream, and that will then lower your blood glucose and your blood lipids. Now, I am oversimplifying it a ton, but we do know that increased muscle mass increases insulin sensitivity, and people with more muscle will have better insulin sensitivity, and even people who have excess body fat, if they have more muscle, have better insulin sensitivity than people with the same amount of body fat who have less muscle. Guys, training is infinitely more complicated than nutrition. Where do you start? How many reps? How many sets? How close to failure? If you're confused about where to start with training, but you don't have the money to hire a coach to expertly guide you, check out the Biolayne Workout Builder. When you subscribe to the Biolayne Workout Builder, you get access to all my evidence-based programming. We have programs for every experience level, goal, and equipment availability. We even have programs for people with essentially no equipment and home gyms or hotel gyms or garage gyms, all the way up to fully equipped commercial gyms. We take all the guesswork out of the reps, sets, and intensity, but give you the flexibility to pick exercises that you prefer and have access to, while still making sure that the exercises that you may sub in are equally effective for building muscle. So if you're ready to take the guesswork out of your training, get strong, and build muscle, click the link in the show notes and sign up to the Biolayne Workout Builder today. So I want to, for a moment, think about all this stuff: insulin sensitivity, muscle mass, adipose tissue. I want you to think of it like a sink filled with water. So the faucet is on. It's either at a slow drip, steady stream, or full blast, and that depends on how much food you're eating. Okay, so that is the energy into the system. Going into the sink, think about the sink as your bloodstream. Okay, the water in the sink as the nutrients, the glucose and blood lipids in your bloodstream. Your muscle is the drain, okay? And then adipose tissue is like an absorbent cloth. So, for example, if we take a pretty dry cloth, like a completely dry cloth, and we put it in that sink, it will absorb some of that liquid and lower that level in the sink. But our biggest lever is if we could open the drain up, if we could make that drain much bigger. Because now, no matter how fast that faucet is going, if that drain is big enough, it's always going to keep it clear. And so this is a very, very, very rudimentary, I'm sure a lot of physiologists will cringe at my description of this, but by expanding your muscle mass, you are opening your sink up and you are giving yourself the ability to dispose of more nutrients in places where they can be properly handled versus being in your bloodstream, which excess glucose in the bloodstream, blood lipids, they cause all kinds of problems. They drastically elevate your risk for cardiovascular disease and a whole host of other problems. So again, 20 years ago, kind of accepted that muscle is probably good for insulin sensitivity, probably good for elderly people to remain ambulatory and have better quality of life. But then the last 10, 15 years, there's been a shift towards this idea that muscle is an organ of health. Now, when I got to graduate school, and I want to give full credit to my PhD advisor, Don Layman, he was one of the first people saying, hey, muscle's an organ. We need to start talking about it like an organ. Because people think of organs and they think of your intestines, they think of your liver, they think of your heart, your brain. You don't think about muscle. But muscle fits every definition of an organ. It serves a very specific purpose. It takes in hormonal signals from other tissues. It sends out hormonal signals to other tissues. It crosstalks with other tissues. It is an endocrine organ by every definition we have. 20, 30 years ago, we kind of thought about adipose tissue as it's just this inert tissue that sits there, and if you eat too much, it soaks it up, and if you eat too little, it frees up energy for you to use. And we didn't think about muscle tissue as being an inert tissue, but we thought about it as it just moves you. That's it. Doesn't really have a function outside of that. And now we know that those two viewpoints of skeletal muscle and adipose are completely wrong. Like I said, when I got to University of Illinois, one of the first things Don Layman said was, we think about things about 5 to 10 years ahead in this lab. And I thought he was just kind of talking trash, but it turns out he was right. And he was saying again at that time, muscle is the organ of health. I don't know if you ever call it the organ of longevity. I've heard that thrown around. I think the data supports that. And to that end, if we look at muscle tissue, it is not just about looking good or being muscular. People who have more muscle live longer. And this is very consistent in the literature. People who have less muscle or sarcopenia, they die younger. And once you start to get into older populations, like above age 50, 60, the effect of muscle mass on all-cause mortality becomes even more dramatic. And having more muscle mass, as we said before, reduces the risk of falls and fractures in the elderly. And that is going to make for a much better overall quality of life. My friend Peter Attia talks about this, and I never thought about it from this perspective, but I really strongly agree with what he says, which is people think about longevity and living as long as they can. But you ought to think about also the quality of those years. For me personally, I would not want to live to 100 years old if 20 of those years are me basically having no quality of life or not having any functionality. He described it as you basically want to fall off a cliff. You want to be kind of going along, and then you have a very high quality of life right until the end, and there's a sharp decline. That is the ideal, because you live long, you are able to enjoy all the years of your life, and then when it's done, it's done. I did not give much thought to the way in which people die or how people die until I watched my grandfather my papo, who is the grandparent I was closest with and somebody I consider a personal hero. He died in his bed at home with his family around him peacefully. And he was still talking up until a few hours before he passed. He was still cracking jokes, actually. And he was ambulatory right up until the last few days. And nobody really wants to think about dying and how you die. But that is a passing of dignity right there. That is something that when myself, my parents, my brother, we look back on that, of course we were sad that my grandfather was dying. But we don't have really like traumatic memories of that. We actually have fond memories of those last days. And that was because Papo was Papo right up until he died. Cognitively, he was there. Physically, he was there. Internally, his organs just kind of went out on him. I remember very clearly thinking, even as a 23-year-old, that is how I'd want to go out. I wouldn't want to go out hooked up to machines. I wouldn't want to go out with this long, protracted, being bedridden or having a very low quality of life or not being able to enjoy my life. That is not how I'd want to go out. And muscle, building muscle, maintaining your muscle into old age is one of the best ways that you can give yourself the best shot to live a long, healthy life with a high quality of life. And then when you pass, do it with dignity. Now, when it comes to mortality, what we're talking about is longevity. So mortality is the risk of dying, essentially. So people who have more muscle live longer. They have better longevity. But how does that happen? It's not random chance. So if we look at the two biggest drivers of death in our country, and I think over the world, it's cardiovascular disease and cancer. And having more muscle mass significantly improves your odds of not dying from these diseases. So if we look at cardiovascular disease mortality, which is people dying specifically from cardiovascular disease, having better body composition reduces your risk of cardiovascular disease mortality. So having more muscle also can go hand in hand with having less fat. But even amongst people who have excess body fat, like we talked about earlier, if you have more muscle, you will have lower risk than somebody who has less muscle. And there's a few ways that muscle reduces your cardiovascular disease mortality risk. One is it improves insulin sensitivity, like we talked about. So having more muscle, bigger metabolic sink, improves your insulin sensitivity. You don't need as much insulin to dispose of the glucose in your bloodstream when you have more muscle. Also, it reduces your levels of inflammation. If you have more muscle, you typically have lower levels of inflammation. Now, it gets complicated because when you lift weights, it causes an inflammatory response, but it's kind of a hormetic response, meaning you have an increase in inflammation over a short period of time. But because, at least the way scientists think about it, because you are activating those systems to clear inflammation, your body gets better at clearing that inflammation because you're giving it a controlled dose of a stressor, this hormetic effect. Now, I know this isn't popular to talk about, but when you give a vaccine, you're giving a deadened or weakened version of a virus that your immune system can handle. It creates antibodies to fight that virus in the future so you can better tolerate it. I cannot think of a better example of what exercise does. So when you exercise, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, your reactive oxygen species, your oxidative stress goes up, your levels of inflammation go up, and your cortisol goes up. Now, if I told you just all of those things that exercise did just now, but I didn't tell you what was doing it, you'd go, oh my God, don't do that. That's horrible for you. But by giving you a controlled dose of a stressor that your body can handle, you train your body to regulate those things better so that they don't get out of control. So actually exercise, even though it does those things that we would consider not good in the short term, it improves them in the long term. So again, when you resistance train, you have more muscle mass, it lowers your levels of inflammation. And you also get improved blood lipids. So these are the mechanisms by which we think that muscle may reduce your cardiovascular disease mortality. The other thing to keep in mind is too, and this is going to be a recurring theme when it comes to diseases, is people who have cardiovascular disease, cancer, a lot of them go through periods of wasting because they're bedridden and can't move. They can't feed normally. And if you have more muscle mass, you have a reservoir of amino acids that your body can pull from to help it create proteins that it might need somewhere else in the body. Now, it's not an ideal situation. Obviously, ideally, you would get those amino acids from your diet, but under extreme circumstances, if you have more muscle, your body can use that to keep itself alive. So we see a decrease in the risk of dying from cardiovascular disease, and we see a big decrease in risk in dying from cancer if you have more muscle. And this is some of the research I found very interesting. So sarcopenia, or having low lean mass, is strongly associated with cancer mortality, dying from cancer. How much? Overall for cancer, low lean mass increases your risk of dying from cancer by 70%. Now that's across broadly cancer. And obviously there's many different types of cancer. But some of them are much higher than that. Let's take colon cancer, for instance, which is one of the deadliest cancers that are out there. Your risk of dying from colon cancer, if you have low lean mass, is over 300% greater than someone who has normal or high lean mass. I just want to let that sit in for a second. You have a 3 times greater risk of dying from colon cancer if you have low lean mass. But it's not just about surviving the cancer you might have. People who have more muscle mass also have lower recurrence of cancer. And I want you to think about something for a moment. Muscle mass is anti-tumorigenic. Some people may find that a weird statement. But I want you to consider for a moment that muscle mass is, for the average person, makes up over 40% of the mass of your body. And yet muscle cancers are extraordinarily rare. Muscle is a hostile environment for tumors. Muscle is not conducive to tumor growth. And we think part of this may be because muscle secretes things like myokines. And myokines may have anti-tumorigenic properties. They also may be beneficial for cardiovascular disease as well. But not only does muscle mass reduce your risk of dying from cancer, not only does it reduce the risk of cancer reoccurrence, you tolerate cancer treatment better when you have more muscle, and the cancer treatment is more effective. The research has shown that people with more muscle mass are better able to tolerate chemotherapy, have lower toxicity, and less side effects than people who have lower amounts of muscle mass. And having more muscle mass reduces the risk of post-operative complications and mortality in people who have cancer surgery. I just want you guys to think about that for a moment and just sit on that. We're not talking about small numbers here. 300%. I believe colon cancer is one of the top 5 most common cancers, and I think it's one of the most lethal. And if you have low muscle, it increases your risk of dying from colon cancer by over 300%, by 3 times as much. Those aren't small numbers. A lot of you guys get hung up on stuff that I think aren't really big levers, don't really matter. Like people will send me a study like, this raised the risk of cancer. And I'll look at it, and first off, the effects aren't consistent. Like take things like artificial sweeteners. The effects are never consistent. And most of the studies say they don't raise the risk of cancer. But let's take the studies that say they do. The risk increase is like 10% relative risk. We are talking about 300%, 70% to 300%. And you're worried about diet soda? Okay. Again, that effect is not consistent when it comes to artificial sweeteners and cancer. But if you're worried about that and you're not lifting weights and eating sufficient protein to build muscle and maintain muscle, you're stepping over $100 bills to pick up pennies. And even something like that I say is important and that we accept as important, like sleep. Every hour reduction in sleep from 7 hours down, I believe increases your risk of mortality by 5%. So if you go from 7 hours to 4 hours, I believe that reduces your risk of mortality by 15%. 15%, I mean, it's not nothing. And I think sleep is important for many reasons, not just that. 15% versus 70% versus 300%. Like, yes, get sleep. I'm not saying they're mutually exclusive. I'm just saying when you're talking about major levers, building muscle is a major lever for preventing disease or surviving disease. Also, interesting note about sleep is people aren't aware of this, but actually you also get an increased risk of mortality for every hour above 8 hours of sleep that you get. And in fact, that increased risk of mortality is greater than the increased risk of mortality of going under 7 hours on a dose-dependent level. Interesting side note, because people tend to think more sleep is better, and the evidence suggests that it might not be. But again, when we're talking about big levers, I mean, building muscle, I think it is as big of a lever as having a healthy body fat level, if not bigger. Obviously, cardiovascular disease and cancer are major levers, but having more muscle mass protects you against other things too. People who have more muscle mass have a lower risk of dying in the intensive care unit. So amongst people who enter the intensive care unit, those who have more muscle mass have a better chance of surviving, and they tend to be discharged faster than people with less muscle mass. There's even anecdotal reports of people with more muscle mass surviving gunshot wounds that other people may not have survived. I mean, multi-time Mr. Olympia Sergio Oliva was shot 5 times in the stomach and survived and actually recovered pretty quickly. Obviously, if you get shot in the brainstem, that's it. There's no amount of muscle mass is going to save you. But when it comes to things like gunshots or trauma, it's not just the trauma that's the problem. There's many things that can go wrong when you're going through trauma surgery. Infection is a huge risk, and sepsis, which basically sepsis is when your body's own bacteria gets into circulation, and now you have an infection essentially from yourself. Because, for example, if you have some kind of abdominal trauma that causes a rupture in, say, your colon, and that gets into circulation, those bacteria can kill you. Sepsis is very, very dangerous. And having more muscle mass reduces your risk of dying from sepsis and infection, partly because people who have more muscle mass appear to have better immune function, and because sepsis is an incredibly wasting disease. It will chew through lean tissue very quickly. And so if you have more lean tissue, then you are more resistant to dying from wasting from something like sepsis compared to people who have less muscle tissue. But it's not just about surviving disease. It is about hopefully not getting these diseases. And muscle, we don't really see a decrease in the risk of cancer with muscle. There's some evidence that resistance training will decrease your risk of developing cancer. But again, when it comes to if you have cancer, muscle strongly predicts how well you can survive it and tolerate treatment. But we do know that having more muscle reduces your risk of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular disease events. So people who have more muscle are less likely to develop cardiovascular disease or have any kind of major cardiovascular disease event. And again, this is because skeletal muscle improves insulin sensitivity and metabolic health. It reduces liver fat. Muscle reduces arterial stiffness, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. It reduces inflammation and oxidative stress, both of which are risk factors for cardiovascular disease. As we discussed earlier, muscle releases its own myokines like IL-10, irisin, FSTL1, and those may be cardioprotective. So muscle is not just this inert tissue sitting there moving your bones when you want it to. Muscle is secreting things that may protect other organs and systems. Now, like I said, overall, there doesn't seem to be a reduced risk of cancer overall, but there is a reduced risk of certain cancers with having increased muscle, including bladder and kidney cancer. And as we discussed previously, muscle secretes these myokines, which are anti-tumorigenic and create an unfavorable environment for tumor growth. So what could be happening is perhaps muscle doesn't prevent the initial damage to the DNA, because essentially the way cancer begins developing, and I'm painting with a broad brush, but there's some kind of insult or damage to the DNA, and it could be from genetics, it could be from environment, and that causes the DNA to start replicating and these cells to start replicating faster than they should be. So perhaps muscle mass doesn't prevent that from happening, but perhaps it impedes the growth of these tumors through these anti-tumorigenic molecules like myokines. And those seem to create an unfavorable environment for tumor growth. And like we discussed before, increased skeletal muscle mass may improve immune function, and immune function and your immune system is one of your body's primary ways that it endogenously fights cancer. In fact, the best cancer treatments on the market right now are immunotherapies, which basically are modifying your own immune system cells to specifically target cancer cells. Those therapies have given my mom more years of life because she has multiple myeloma and she's had it for 11 years. But these new immune therapies, they're not calling it a cure yet, but they appear to be very, very effective. And so if you have more muscle mass, that's going to help you have a healthier immune system, which may help you fight off some of the diseases like cancer. Now, we talked about ICU stuff. We talked about risk of infection from sepsis, but there's also evidence that if you get an infection, that having more muscle mass reduces your risk of serious side effects, complications, and hospitalization. And that goes for COVID. People with more muscle mass had lower risk of hospitalization from COVID, bacterial infections, and increased muscle density decreases the risk of infection after abdominal trauma. So again, that's probably like a sepsis thing, but when you have better muscle mass, it protects you. Now let's talk about some stuff that I think I found the most interesting and I think may shock you the most. I think a lot of you probably are not surprised that resistance training, building muscle may help with insulin sensitivity, cardiovascular disease. Maybe even the cancer stuff didn't surprise you that much. But what if I told you that having muscle mass was important for your mental health? One of the biggest levers you can pull to reduce your risk of Alzheimer's and dementia is to have sufficient muscle mass. People who have sarcopenia are 300% more likely to develop Alzheimer's and dementia. And this is in line with data demonstrating that people who resistance train or have more muscle have lower levels of anxiety, have reduced symptoms of depression, and have better cognitive function and better memory. This idea that muscle is for meatheads is just not true. Yeah, can you find people out there that are big dumb jocks? Of course you can. Of course you can. But the evidence suggests they'd be even dumber if they didn't lift weights. The evidence seems to suggest that lifting weights improves your cognitive function, improves your memory, reduces your symptoms of depression, reduces the chance of anxiety, and is a shield against dementia and Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. Anecdotally, if I think about the elderly people who were the sharpest that I've been around, down to a person, they were all active into old age. If you want a sharp mind, you have to push your body. It seems strange. For a long time, physiology and psychology were viewed as separate entities and disconnected. They matter for each other. What happens in your body affects your mind, and what happens in your mind affects your body. And for example, like we just talked about, more muscle mass, resistance training improves symptoms of depression, anxiety, lower risk of cognitive decline. But also, if you are psychologically stressed, if you have more psychological stress, that actually increases your risk of disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, mortality. Also, psychological stress impairs performance in people who play sport. So again, we used to view the mind and the body as separate. And I'm hoping that one of the biggest, most significant changes of 21st century science will be the acknowledgement that the mind and body are connected and should not be viewed separately. And a more holistic approach to this should be taken. But it's not just depression. It's not just Alzheimer's, cognitive decline. It's not just anxiety. Lifting weights, exercise, building muscle improves many different aspects of mental health. In fact, if you have sarcopenia, if you're low muscle mass, you are at greatly enhanced risk of being bipolar. And actually, if you resistance train, the research has shown resistance training reduces bipolar symptoms. Low muscle mass also increases the risk of schizophrenia. And resistance training, again, may reduce symptoms of schizophrenia. Again, low muscle mass increases your risk of depression, and resistance training reduces your symptoms of depression. In fact, there was a study from 2023 where they took men with major depressive disorder and general anxiety disorder, and they had them do 8 weeks of resistance training 2 times a week for 25 minutes per session. 50 minutes a week. That's it. 50 minutes a week. And the reduction in the depressive symptoms they saw, they use what's called a Cohen's d effect size. Now, many of you know about significance. Like we'll say p-value less than 0.05 is considered significant. And quick and dirty explanation of that is if p is less than 0.05, then it means there's less than a 5% chance that the differences you saw between the treatment groups were due to random chance. Okay? Cohen's d, or effect sizes, refer to how powerful is the treatment, because you can have something that's a significant effect that's not very powerful, and so it's not that clinically relevant. So this effect of resistance training on depressive symptoms was significant, and the Cohen's d was 1.7 for reducing symptoms of depression. Now, effect sizes are generally considered small if they're less than 0.2, moderate if they're like 0.3 to 0.5, and above a 0.8 is considered a large effect size. So 0.8 is considered a large effect size. 1.7. Now, just to give perspective, where do SSRIs rank on that scale? SSRIs are around 0.3 to 0.5 in terms of effect size. 8 weeks, 50 minutes a week, 1.7. Massive effect size. Massive. Now, I am not saying that lifting weights is a cure for depression, and I am not saying that people should do lifting weights instead of SSRIs, because anybody who's had depression, they understand that you may know that lifting weights is good for you and you just can't physically bring yourself to do it. So maybe somebody needs an SSRI just to get themselves out of bed so they can go lift the weights and get the benefits. I'm not here to judge. The point is, lifting weights, having more muscle, reduces your risks of a myriad of mental health disorders. So if you want to live longer, you want less disease, you want to be more resilient from disease, you want to have better mental health, you want to lift weights and build muscle. I know the idea as well, if you're building muscle, you're going to be muscle bound and inflexible. The research doesn't support that. In fact, the research supports that when you do resistance training through a full range of motion, you get basically the same benefits on flexibility and mobility as static stretching. If you train a muscle through a full range of motion, it will become more flexible and more mobile. And people who have more muscle have less pain. People who resistance train have less pain. Now, some people say, well, when you're old, all that lifting, you're going to have pain. Hey, look, I have not met a 70-year-old who doesn't have some pain. And that includes people who are sedentary. And the research shows people who are sedentary have more pain. People who have less muscle have more pain. When you are old, you will have pain no matter what. Now, you can be weak and have pain, or you can be strong and have pain. And you get to choose which one you want. If I'm going to have pain, I choose strength. As we discussed, there's a lower risk for falls and fractures. And again, once you get past a certain age, if you fall and break a bone, it can be devastating. It can mean you're confined to a wheelchair for the rest of your life. It may mean you die. But if you have more muscle, even if you do fall, even if you do break a bone, which the research says you're less likely to, but even if you do, you are more likely to survive it and get back to full functionality if you have more muscle. Hey, it's Dr. Layne Norton here, and if you are tired of fad diets, bro science, and spinning your wheels in the gym, it's time to work with the pros. Team Biolayne provides custom, one-on-one, science-based nutrition and training coaching. No cookie-cutter plans, no BS. Just real science, real results, and my team of expert coaches who actually know what they are doing. Whether you're trying to build muscle, lose fat, or just stop yo-yo dieting, our team of expert coaches have helped thousands of people just like you get real results and sustain them. So if you are tired of spinning your wheels and you are ready to take your fitness journey seriously, head to the link in the show notes or go to biolayne.com/coaching and apply to work with Team Biolayne today. We don't guess, we assess. This next one's going to be more intuitive. Having more muscle mass protects you against wasting diseases. We kind of talked about this with sepsis already, but even diseases like HIV, if you have more muscle mass, you have better chances of survival with HIV. Now, again, with the new treatments for HIV, it looks like HIV is now something that you live with and you die with, not necessarily from. But back when HIV was essentially a death sentence, people with more muscle mass who had HIV lived longer than people who had less. Now, a lot of muscle wasting diseases, for a while, there was some worry about, should we have these people resistance train? Because when you resistance train, you break muscle down. If they're having a wasting disease, maybe they can't build it back up and it's just going to make it worse. And so things like multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophy, ALS, there was real concern about maybe these people shouldn't resistance train. And now we know that if you resistance train, it improves the symptoms of multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophy. Those people have better quality of life when they resistance train, and they can build muscle. And even ALS, the research is a little bit more mixed, but there's some evidence that if you resistance train with ALS, it will slow the degradation of your muscular system. Now, it's not just about all that. But again, my story about my grandfather and watching him die with dignity. Independence is a big thing for people who are elderly. Being able to drive your own car, walk somewhere, get up out of bed by yourself, sit down on the toilet by yourself, stand up by yourself, bathe yourself. People with low muscle mass have a 1,200% increased risk of losing their physical independence versus those with more muscle mass. 1,200%. 12 times greater risk than people who have more muscle mass. Muscle mass is not just about vanity. Your life literally depends on it. Now, I'm not saying you got to get as jacked as me or bodybuilders or anything like that. You don't have to go for hours and hours a week. 1 hour a week of resistance training, you can get a ton of benefit from that. A ton. Just having a decent amount of muscle mass is going to protect you against so much of this stuff. And I know some people out there will say, man, I'm 60 already. I'm 70. I'm this age. It's over for me. I can't. No, that's where you're wrong. The research shows very clearly older people can build muscle the same as young people. Now, again, we talked about the meal responses of muscle protein synthesis, that you may need proportionally more protein. But when they do resistance training studies, even in frail elderly, above age 80, they show increases in muscle mass, improved functionality, and increases in strength. Frail elderly above age 80 can build muscle. There is no age at which you can't build muscle. And I can't think of any condition in which having more muscle is a negative. Maybe one exists, I can't think of it. It might literally save your life one day. These are massive differences in risk of disease or dying from disease or developing disease. But there's no age at which you can't build muscle. The best time to start is right now, where you're at. And again, even the research literature in elderly shows that they build a similar amount of muscle as young people as a percentage of their starting lean mass. Now, again, when you're elderly, you have less lean mass overall. And so, for example, if somebody starts with, say, 40 kilos of lean mass, another person starts with 60 kilos of lean mass, and they both increase by 10%, that means on an absolute level, one person built 4 kilos and the other person built 6 kilos. But as a percentage of their starting, they built the same. So I want to empower you. If you have a working spinal column, you can build muscle. You can get healthier. Even if you're obese, even if you have excess body fat, even if you don't lose that body fat, if you build muscle, it will make you healthier, more insulin sensitive, and it will decrease your risk of disease and death. I'm going to leave you guys with a quote from Mark Ripito. Now, this is not an endorsement of him or necessarily his thoughts on training and nutrition, but I like the quote. Stronger people are more useful generally than weak people and harder to kill. Strong people are harder to kill. Strong people are more resistant to disease. Strong people are healthier. Strong people are more resilient. Strong people survive. Building strength, building muscle mass, it is not just for vanity. If you want to live a long time and have a high quality of life with less disease, with better mental health, muscle building is not an option. It is an imperative. It has to be on your list of must-dos. And that is why you should care about building muscle, because your life may literally depend on it.